Hello and welcome, weary podcast traveler. This is my viewfinder. I have found it interesting in building relationships with creatives here in Calgary, how we inadvertently begin to align ourselves with traditional philosophical ways of thinking. I got this impression after speaking with my friend Curtis Des. You see, Curtis does not want to affiliate himself or his practice of photography with any broader classification. This strikes me as very similar to the Stoics. My introductory understanding is that the Stoics believe rational consideration as a way of life. Philosophy is not meant to be a thought experiment. Rather, it's a structural guide to a good life. They stress the idea of good as something broad and greater than individual passions. Generally speaking, personal wealth, gain, pleasure, they're seen as categorically not good. Aiming for wealth and pleasure in itself can never lead to true happiness. What is good or should be aimed at are wisdom, knowledge, courage, and moderation. Happiness then becomes a function of a rational assessment and intention to aim towards natural purpose. Only in this intentional aim can true happiness be attained. Hence the characterization that Stoics do not have fun. But in life, this can't be so black and white. There can be great pleasure in acts that are virtuous. For example, exercising, work, love, and relationships. The measure and moderation of these experiences become important to not swing so far as to lose the ultimate aim of virtue. The key is that they aren't aims in themselves. A genuinely happy person transcends the trappings of wealth or popularity. The Stoic photographer doesn't need high-profile contracts or millions of followers. They derive the value of their art form from the action itself. How it is interpreted or shared is secondary, perhaps even inconsequential. Here's my chat with Curtis. Let me know what you think. Do you agree with my interpretation of his worldview when it relates to photography? Take a listen and let's circle back after the episode concludes. What did we decide we were going to chat about?
It's your podcast, man. You guys fucking organized. I came straight from like back to back meetings, so I have no idea.
You know, I was researching, I suppose you can call it lightly, reading into the idea of some of the philosophies and thought processes behind photography. And, there are many different angles, but many more kind of played out. But then I stumbled upon this guy, Wilhelm Fusser, and he is a philosopher who passed away in the 90s. Not very well known. I'd never heard of him before, but I watched a lecture of his on YouTube. And he brought up this really fascinating thing. He actually wrote lectures on the philosophy of photography. And he talks about how photography's birth and its inception come from this idealistic and, in his mind, like problematic idea of being able to capture a moment, to be able to display a happening as it truly is in the world, which goes into journalism. But post-World War II, we learned that the picture is not actually reality. It can be twisted out of context. And particularly in journalism, you can take a frame, let's say a war photographer, and depending on what text or which picture you select, you can actually politicize an image, and therefore it completely changes the idea of what photography is. And so my thought process with this is to kind of talk to people about whether photography is real. And the only way to do that without getting too abstract, I think, particularly with photographers, is maybe having this approach and saying like, okay, whether it's the Asia trip or your experience at the markets or what people will buy or nature versus quote unquote street, I think, particularly with your experiences in anything you feel comfortable talking about, that as we chat about it, I think these themes can come up because you have a lot of not only experience, but you think about this. I know you do, maybe not specifically in delineated, but you think about photography a lot when we talk about it. And whenever we talk about photography, these itchings, this nuance is there. The fact that we can become disillusioned with photography, there's something about that that's problematic or reflective maybe of this. So, this is my giant preamble, which I'll edit 80% of, but that's kind of where I want to be. So as far as a leading in question, Curtis, I think my thought process was that if we pick something you were actually passionate about or have an idea about, then maybe we could have the discussion along these lines about. So like if it's the piece behind you and you want to tell me a story about the homeless man and woman, about how these things came together, I think it will still pull the right strings, and I think it might give us something to talk about.
Sure. Yeah, it's funny when you said being disillusioned by photography or whatever, and I don't think I've ever been disillusioned or by photography. You become disillusioned of the idea of what you of having to define what you think photography is, or why you're doing it, or all those sorts of things. I've taken I mean, especially since this whole COVID thing has popped off, I've taken a real step back. I've barely touched my camera other than capturing stuff at home, and I've also just taken time away from social media. I think my social media, like my screen time, is down below anywhere where it's ever been. Because I think what I started to realize is that for me, photography was something that I got into as a means of escape. Much like people pick up going to the gym or whatever. I would pick up my camera and I would go out and I would explore, and it was rather than just wandering around aimlessly, it gave me something to do, and it took me out of my comfort zone, and it made me see things differently, and I would meet people, and not only that, but it would just allow for me to be by myself, and in a way that I felt more comfortable doing than just sitting down and actually trying to go through a meditation practice, because that would have been something that was completely foreign to me. But essentially that's what it was, right? It was almost like a gateway into getting inside my own head, or not even outside of my own head, I guess. So that's and now I've come back after doing this for 10 years, however long I've been doing it. I've kind of come back to that, where it's like, stop analyzing what this is. Stop thinking, are you doing street photography? Do you want to get into this? Do you want to get into that? I don't want to do any of that. I don't want to call it anything. I just want to, if it strikes me to take a picture of something, or I feel like going out and doing some street photography or whatever, or just do it. Just do whatever I feel. And because it's a release for me, I can't have it as something that I have to define, or that I have to, and I'm lucky because obviously it's not a full-time job for me, and I don't think I could ever do it as a full-time job, because it kills me. It just, as soon as I start to think about money, and I start to think about what I'm trying to do, and like how I want to represent myself and all this bullshit, like I just can't do it. It's too much. I'm just doing me, you know what I mean? So yeah, I'm just kind of getting back to that practice of just using photography as just another extension of myself, and just just like I work out or I read a book, like I take pictures for myself 100%. And if I do post something online, it's more just to put it out there, and because I think photography is awesome, and it's cool to share stuff, and it's cool if someone takes something positive out of it, obviously it's done a lot for me in my life, I think, and I'm not talking financially or anything like that. I'm talking just mental health wise. It's done a shit ton for me. So if I put some pictures out there and people say, oh yeah, it's kind of neat that you can go out and take pictures and create something out of nothing, and whatever, if it inspires someone else to pick up a camera and do the same thing, and then it gets them out of their heads, like that's for me now more the purpose of anything. But I got to worry about myself above all else. So myself, my daughter, obviously, but so I'm not overthinking things anymore, because it just doesn't matter.
Well, I wonder, number one, using photography as an art form or as a practice to get out of oneself in a meditative sense or in a practice sense. But then when we talk, or when you bring up separating types of photography, does that tension, do you think, come from this idea of like there being an audience? It stops being about your own practice. I wonder, you start losing that contact, right, of what it meant for you in its most idealistic or purest form. I don't know. What do you think about something like that? There are moments that I've known you in the short time that been sort of photography friends, but that you might have identified yourself as a street photographer or as a portrait photographer. Photography, I think, in its nature, is for an audience in a way. I mean, as much as we as photographers want to kind of announce that we are purists, many of us, that we do this for some kind of personal, spiritual something. At the end of the day, if nobody sees the work and it exists in a vacuum, it's something different about it. But then, I don't know if ironically or dialectically, whatever the right term is, once somebody else sees it, then all of a sudden we get very weird about it. It changes the context of what that image is. For me, there's a lot of tension for that.
To me, then it does not. And to me, it is 100% for me, because I'm doing it 100% for me. And that's I've gone through different stages where that wasn't the case. And in those, when I was at those stages, I wasn't enjoying it, because I was trying to fit into a box, or I was trying to, play to a certain audience. I like everything. I like street photography. I like portraits. I like fashion photography. Not that I do any of these things like particularly well or focus on anything. I just do whatever the fuck I please, or whatever appeals to me, right? I'll post stuff, but then I post it and I get off. Because it doesn't change. To me, it doesn't change it. It doesn't, because for me, it's the experience of doing it that's the most important thing, because I'm not doing it for anyone else. I'm not doing it to sell it. I'm not doing it for a job. I mean, obviously there are social connections and social things that weigh in, and if you don't, if you lose sight of what you're actually doing, then yeah, it's pretty easy to slip back into that, like, oh no one's liking my picture, no one told me how nice my picture is, boo-hoo me. It's easy to slip into that, obviously, because of the way that things are set up, but it does, to me, in my mind, it doesn't change anything. And that's kind of where I'm at right now, where it's like, everything that I'm doing is just 100% for me.
What if I asked you this? I mean, do you find that it is healthier to have that approach, particularly at a spiritual level, to be able to take a craft or a practice or a passion and to try to find a personal ideal? But in reflection, do you think that it affects the approach, the planning, the motivation to go out and shoot a particular thing? So, for example, maybe when you were focusing a lot on, let's say, like when we went out finding street portraits, I mean, we were shooting everything, but you get excited when you see a moment to go and run out and ask someone for their portrait at that stage, right? Is that something that you think changes once you take away the idea of, let's say, social media or saleability or a relationship with a third party? Do you find like now there's a different way, different things that interest you when you shoot?
No, I get what you're saying. There's and no, it doesn't. But again, like, I'm not going out to, if I'm going out, I'm not going out with any goals. And maybe my stuff would be better if I did, but I'm going out and I'm just wandering. I'm just exploring. If there's someone I see that looks interesting, I might approach them, take a portrait. If I see a piece of garbage on the ground, I might take a picture of that, whatever strikes me. And like I said, like, I don't really care. I have thousands of pictures that I just sit on, from all kinds of places. And like, that's every once in a while, I just throw a couple pictures out onto social media, just, I guess so people know that I'm not dead. But yeah, it doesn't at all influence me anymore. I should say that, because obviously it has, right? I mean, I think at the beginning, social media for me was great because it motivated me to go and shoot. So I'm like, oh, I gotta post more. I gotta go shoot. And then, you start seeing what works and what doesn't work as far as, getting people's attention, drawing people in, and you start to focus on those different things. But then and they're like, oh, well, I can make a little bit of money too. Maybe I should focus on this stuff because this stuff can make me a little bit of money and it's going to get me, but I've kind of done all that stuff. And maybe if I made more money doing the stuff that I was doing, maybe I wouldn't be at the place that I'm at now. But for me, yeah, I'm just gotten back to the place where the photography is just about me. So I'm not letting any of those things influence me because, yeah, that's not what it's about.
Like I was thinking while you were speaking, like, is there maybe not one event, but do you remember what it is that got you to be interested in street portraiture rather than as, like, let's say, studio or like for artists? There are different ways to approach portraiture, right? And particularly with your work that I'm aware of, being able to just be inspired, but then use, lighting and environmental things and an interesting subject. That's a pretty nuanced thing. What I know you as predominantly is street port. I mean, again, not as a label for you as an artist, but street portraiture is a big thing that you do that not a lot of people are capable of doing, whether they're in a candid sense or a directed sense. But it is interesting, there's representations there of how people see themselves. I mean, most people have such paranoia, I think, at least my small perspective is, there's a paranoia that comes with that, right?
So I mean, the first question you sort of asked was around why. I think you kind of said why street portraits rather than than something else. And I mean, the only reason for that is just accessibility, right? At the time I got into photography, I lived downtown, so it just kind of made sense for me to just go wander a little bit. And I think that's just the documentary photography was what I was drawn to. We talked about that last time, where, George Weber's work and a lot of the classic, Robert Frank, Gordon Parks, those types of guys. That's more what I was drawn to. So it just made sense to just wander and just be able to, create something out of nothing if I felt like it. Because again, it was I don't want to plan a big thing, and not that I didn't do a lot of those other sorts of things, shooting models and whoever else, but yeah, it was just accessibility. That's all, and just the type of photography that I was drawn to.
Do you think documentary photography still exists?
Yeah. Again, I mean, it does, but I mean, everything has it exists as much as journalism exists. You got to take it all with a grain of salt, right?
I don't know. I've become very suspect about whether those things represent what they say they represent anymore.
But what do they say?
Do
they say anything? What do you mean? What do you mean? What they say they represent?
Well, what's the famous one, like the Americans or whatever?
Yeah.
So you presumably flip through that book, and there is a strong narrative that this is supposed to represent a moment of time that really expresses what America was in this time frame. For street portraiture, for example, just to be more direct, this person exists at this corner, this is what they look like. But that's where I get stuck, to be honest. I wonder if that's changed too much and we've lost our faith in it, and if maybe photography is responsible for that I can't trust anything I see anymore. So unlike you, I'm very disillusioned with this art form. Especially as I manipulate everything.
But you're talking about two different things. You're talking about an art form, and you're talking about documentary photography as a document of something. It's something real that is exactly as it's portrayed. I mean, those are two very different things.
But maybe that's my thing. Maybe so. I guess I'm positing that they're the same. That there isn't a distinction between them, and that a lot of the cultural trust and weight we put on it is problematic. It's like we worship, well, it's a strong word, but we worship this past and these works as these pure things. I think I live in a world where imagery and photography have become poisonous. I think that it's informing people to make decisions in their lives to look like something instead of actually acting or doing something. So one of the examples that's brought up in one of the lectures is that people get married in order to be photographed getting married, as opposed to committing to the concept of marriage. So they're not worried about relationships. They're not seeking for some type of connection or commitment to the future. I used to blame American movies for this, that a rom-com will always end at the point where they kiss and never need to explore the fact that you still have to live 60 more years with this human being. Because who wants to watch 60 years of a narrative? But I think it's poisoned the well a little bit. And I worry that photography is the main problem. But we have this faith in it, that it represents something real. But I wonder if in its outset, it's actually very biased and kind of lying to us.
Well,
Is that too strong?
yeah, it's way too strong. Photography can't be biased. It's not a thing. It's not a real thing. It's something that we do. So photography in itself cannot be biased. It's whoever's creating the image, that could have bias. But I mean, that's true with anything in life. I mean, that's true of journalism. That's true of a story. That's true of anything. I think you're reading a lot into it, and that's maybe what's pushing you in that direction. I mean, you're also making a lot of very broad assumptions that, people are getting married just so they can get photographed. You'd have to be a pretty sick person to get married just so that you can have some nice pictures. I mean, obviously there are people in this world that want to fit into a certain mold, so they do certain things because they feel like it will allow them to fit into whatever segment of society it is that they're trying to fit into. Sure that happens, but that's more an issue of someone who just doesn't really know themselves and who's just looking for an identity, right? It's not photography. Photography is just a tool that you can use in whichever way you choose, right? But it's also, I mean, there's a lot of photography is left to interpretation. I can take an image that I think is absolutely beautiful, and someone could look at it and be disgusted by it, right? So it's not because I manipulated the picture in a certain way that's why they're disgusted by it. It's just because they come into it looking at the image with a whole lifetime of biases and experiences and different things that inform how it is that they're going to interpret that image. So it has absolutely nothing to do with photography as a negative thing, or even myself as putting out a photograph that's a negative thing. It has to do with whatever that person is taking it as. I mean, same thing with when you talk about movies and Hollywood and things like that. Like, I get it. I get how certain people are portrayed and how all of that stuff can be damaging. But again, I mean, there's always different sides to things, right? And to automatically just go to the negative, I think that's more something that each individual person has to, manage within themselves.